after this webinar, we will be sending the recording, and it will be available publicly on our website. So, and the slides as well. So if you need to look again for more information, you'll be able to. You have the possibility also to ask questions. I think it's very important. My goal in this webinar is that you understand everything, you understand what I will say. So it's very important that you ask questions in case you have some issues. So feel free, you should have a button somewhere underneath to ask questions. Feel free to do it. And just a few words that I have here with me. My colleagues Amy Leeds and Gary Machado, who are also connected as co-hosts, and they can also jump in the discussion and have a look at your questions. And I see actually that somebody has been testing the questions, and I can confirm that it works. And as I speak, I see we are now 113 people in the room, so it's good to see some interest in the legislation. So welcome to this webinar. Myself, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Benoît Vivier, I'm Public Affairs Manager at EENA. I have a background in EU politics, so I'm one of these nerds who follow EU legislation and who do read it. So I've been working at EENA for now 7 years and trying to basically translate what is being said in Brussels, the EU jargon, into practical actions for public safety professionals. So happy to have the discussion today with you. This is our program for today. So we'll start actually, I swear I'll try not to be boring, with very short basics of EU legislation, just to basically to allow you to understand what is then said a bit later in the webinar. So I'll try to keep it short. I'll try to keep it even entertaining. It's not super easy with legislation, but I'll do my best. Then we'll have some recap about EU law on emergency communications, because there has been many, and I can understand that some of you are a bit confused with that. So I'll just recap everything so that we'll see better where we are now and what is coming next. And finally, we'll jump in the content of the delegated regulation. And for those of you who are checking your emails or Facebook as I am speaking, no worries, I have prepared also a summary at the end of the webinar so that you can listen to the key elements of it. All right, if you're ready, let's jump and let's start the content of this webinar. So first of all, I'd like to make one recap. So some of you may know it, some will not know it. I want to do a recap about the different types of legislation in the European Union. I know it's boring, but it's something you have to know to better understand this legislation. So I'll try to keep it short, but basically what is essential to remember is that the two main types of legislation at EU level are the directives and the regulations. They are both mandatory, so it means that they will apply to, like what is said, has to be applied by the member state. It's not optional, it's mandatory. The difference is that the directive, they require transposition into the member state's national law. Transposition means basically to translate what is written in the legislation and to basically put that into the national law. So a directive will be voluntarily quite vague in the terms. It will set some objectives that the member states must meet, and then they remain free to decide how they want to do it, and that's in the transposition phase. As opposition, the regulations are self-executive. Self-executive, it means that when the law enters into force, the provisions of it are directly in application into the member state's national law, and the national authorities don't have to do anything. The law is already in application. So there are the directives, there are the regulations. These are the two main types of EU norms. There are other norms, and one of them is what interests us today is the delegated acts. When I say delegated acts, it can be a delegated directive or a delegated regulation. These legislations are mandatory, also like directives and regulations. The difference is that, so basically what the delegated acts they do is that they will only complement what has been written in a directive or regulation. Is not an act per se, basically just complements or supplements some elements of the previous legislation. So can only bring information, bring clarification, or just modify the non-essential elements of the law, but it cannot like amend it a lot. The reason for that is that the directives and regulations, they are voted by the European Parliament, which represents the EU citizens, and the Council of the EU, which represents the member states. So these are, let's say, politically elected bodies. In the delegated acts, basically, you have the Parliament and the Council. They give a power to the European Commission to adopt the acts. So the advantage is that it's a bit less democratic because there's less scrutiny by the Parliament and the Council, though there is, but I won't go into detail. But it's much faster to adopt. It takes a few months only, the adoption phase, while for directives and regulation, it takes in average 2 years, which is very long. So you don't, sometimes if it's just to clarify one element, you don't always want to spend like years just to discuss a very technical thing, which is why we have the delegated acts, which is what interests us today. There are many other types of norms, and I will not bore you with that today. I will just stick to these three. Something also I wanted to record is how to read the legislation. I know that it can be a bit scary sometimes to read legislation. Myself, I've had that fear for like standards, for instance. I don't like to open them because I always think like, oh, it's not for me and I don't have the competence to read it. You can actually read the legislation. It's quite straightforward to understand. I will actually move myself because I'm hiding a bit of the slides. I put myself here, it will be better. How do you read the EU legislation? The main parts that you have to look at when you read the EU legislation is the articles. It's where basically all the binding elements are. You have to think that in one article, every word there requires attention. Like every word is in an article for a reason. So there's no unnecessary words. There's no word that is missing. What you want to be binding should be in the article. So that's really the main thing you should look at. The language can be a bit technical for that reason, actually, because it is aimed really at like just setting the obligations. As I speak about that, actually, there's one very important point to make on the language. Whenever you read shall, member states shall ensure, this is an obligation. So here in what I quote, there's an obligation on member states to have public warning systems. By opposition, when you read member states may, this is optional. They don't have the obligation. They can do it if they want. So it's important when you read the legislation to have that distinction in mind between shall and may, because of course that means very different types of impositions. But that's not only the article that you should look at when you read an EU legislation. What is also important to have a look at are the recitals. So the recitals, they precede the articles, they come before, and it's basically what starts with whereas, and then you have different paragraphs that always start with like the numbers between parentheses. So the recitals as such, they're not binding, but they're here to basically to recall the background, the context behind an obligation, behind an article. So you will see basically what is in an article, but perhaps with better language, with easier to read language. And also it will recall why we have this obligation. So as such, they're not binding, as I said. However, when the European Court of Justice is required to interpret a legislation, they have a look at that. So in the end, that's kind of binding because it can be used by the European Court of Justice in the interpretation of the law, sorry. So yeah, it's quite important to have a look at the recitals because it's also where in general you get a better overview of what is in the legislation. Not only the articles and the recitals, but actually as part of it, it's important to have a look at the very first articles. Actually, it's usually article 2 or 3. It starts with a definition in the legislation. As I said, every word matters in an article. So the definitions are very important to have a look at because, of course, they will mean like a few words, a group of words can mean very, very different things. So having a look at the definition means also what is in the scope of something and what is not in the scope. So that's important to have a look at it. It always comes in the very beginning of the articles. And as I insist to have a look at the beginning, it's also important to have a look at the ends of a legislation, the very last articles. You have all the deadlines that are recalled, and especially if it's a directive, you'll have also the information about the transposition deadline, which is usually a year and a half or 2 years after the entry into force of the legislation. So it's quite important to have a look at it. And I think that is it for my first recap. If you have any question about it, just feel free to write it. Just going to have a bit of water to leave you some time also to write the questions. Okay, don't see anything, so I'll just continue. with another very important recap, is where we are with EU legislations on emergency communications. I realize that many of you might get a bit lost sometimes because there's plenty of legislations, and sometimes you receive emails from me about like different pieces of legislation. So it's good that I do some kind of recap with where we are. So we're here in early 2023. So we have, many of you remember from already 5 years ago, close to 5 years ago, the European Electronic Communications Code. This is what EECC stands for, with different deadlines for Article 109 and Article 110. I'll come to that after. And it's in the context of the EECC that we have the Delegated Act, because the Delegated Act supplements the European Electronic Communications Code. So as you remember from my part before, it just aims at giving more precisions to this text. At the same time, we are also in the process of implementation of the EU Accessibility Act, which is about accessibility for people with disabilities to a wide range of services in the EU, including access to emergency services. Another legislation you probably read about was the roaming regulation. A new version was adopted mid last year, I think May or June. So it is now enforced because it's a regulation, so it is self-effective. Some of you may remember the delegated regulation that was once again a delegated act, supplementing the radio equipment directive, which actually made AML mandatory in all the smartphones in the EU. That was in 2019. And finally, at the end of the year, we expect, or perhaps next year, we expect a proposal for a new equal regulation. So this is something we will be looking at. So this is a bit where we are with the EU law on emergency communications. And for the purpose of this webinar, I will focus on the first lines, basically, which is about the European Electronic Communications Code. And I will first refresh a bit your minds when we were back in 2018 with the adoptions of this text. So we had different elements that were of relevance for emergency services and emergency access. First was the Article 108, which basically asked the member state to take all measures to ensure continuous access to emergency services and to prevent disruptions of service. Then the main part on emergency communications handling was in Article 109, with paragraph 1 calling for 112 to be available free of charge in all the EU. That was obligatory, and that still is, of course. Paragraph 2 was about the routing of the emergency communications to the most appropriate PSAP, and the part on emergency communications was quite an innovation, let's say, because it replaced emergency calls, which was previously in the legislation. We have paragraph 3, which is about the appropriate handling of 112 communications. And it was recalled that handling should be in the manner best suited to the national organization of emergency systems. Paragraph 4 was about the publication of a report by the European Commission, and what is of big interest for us, paragraph 5 about the accessibility for people with disabilities and the introduction of a principle of equal access to the emergency services for end users with disabilities. Paragraph 6 was about caller location information. The 7 was about the promotion of 112 by member states and the European Commission. And paragraph 8 was about the introduction of the PSAP directory to allow countries to contact each other between PSAPs. And also what brings us today, the delegation to the European Commission to adopt the Delegated Act. I will detail that right after. And finally, Article 110 was about public warning system. It is still relevant, but today we will focus on the Article 109 because this is what the Delegated Act is about. Actually, if we read that Article 109, paragraph 8, you can see that it starts with the following. In order to ensure effective access to emergency services through emergency communications to 112, the European Commission shall, so it's an obligation, adopt delegated acts in accordance with some articles, supplementing paragraphs 2, 5, and 6 of this article on the measures necessary to ensure the compatibility, interoperability, quality, reliability, and continuity of emergency communications. It's quite a list. With regard to caller location information, access for end users with disabilities, and routing to the most appropriate PSAP. And the first of such delegated act was to be adopted by 21st of December 2022. So this is what I said before. Here we have an express delegation of power to the European Commission to adopt the delegated act which is what I will be discussing in the main part of this webinar. Any questions so far? I see two actually that was asked. So does this regulation ECC still integrate the obligation of giving the PSAP a possibility of calling back the caller? No, it is not foreseen in the legislation, for the short answer. And then another question was, it seems important to keep this functionality of eCall now and for further extension. Yes, eCall is quite an important piece of legislation. It's in, as we said, it's in different legislation actually. So the delegated regulation is not linked to eCall, but of course there will be some legislative developments on this. Thank you, Antoine. Yeah, if there's no more question, we can jump now to the main part, which is the content of this delegated regulation. And I propose we go, as we saw, there's a few topics that are addressed by this legislation. 3 of them, I have added the 4th one, but I propose we go together topic per topic to explain a bit what is mandated in that. So the first one will be the main one that is covered by this legislation, is about caller location for emergency communications. If you followed the EECC, so EECC is the European Electronic Communications Code, you should know that all emergency communications in the EU should be located and that location should include both the network-based and the handset-based location. Network-based is basically the position of the cell-based station, and the handset-based is what is provided by AML, so the location you have on your phone typically. So this is already now mandatory. And what this act does, it will give additional specifications. So first of all, there's actually a recall of something that is in the legislation since 2009, is the obligation on national authorities to establish caller location accuracy and reliability criteria. This is something that is just recalled in this act. It existed since 2009. It has never been enforced for a couple of reasons. So this is a principle that is recalled. And then that legislation will add additional parameters to take into account to implement this criteria, and then elements to basically make sure that this will finally be enforced. So what is very important to have in mind, and I think to me that is quite a change, is that the criteria adopted by the member states, so it's basically sets like what type of location you should expect for emergency communications, is that the criteria adopted should be precise enough for the emergency services to assist the victim. This is clearly said in the legislation. So it should basically allow the emergency services to usefully come to the end user's position. So that means that the criteria adopted by the national authorities should be very precise, because 2 kilometers is not sufficient to assist the victims. And of course, 2 kilometers is not something you get today with AML, but it's what you can get with network-based location at the moment. But it is recalled here, and it's the second part of the recital I have quoted. The mix of these technologies ensure that even where a handset-derived caller location solution fails to make the caller location information available to the most appropriate PSAP, emergency services can rely on the network-based location to usefully come to the end user's assistance in line with the caller location criteria established by the member states. So this is a principle that was stated in a ruling from the European Court of Justice, which is recalled here. And it's quite important to have that in mind, is that when the national authorities will have to adopt criteria for network-based location, they will have to take this principle into account. So to me, it's actually quite a major change actually that is proposed in the legislation. Actually, how will this criteria look like? Here you have to distinguish between the mobile network and the fixed line, because there's still a few people who call from the fixed line. Of course, the biggest part of emergency communications today come from mobile networks. So the criteria for these networks should be expressed in a certain percentage of emergency communications, providing a location within a certain number of meters. It's typically criteria you have in other countries outside of Europe. Outside of the Union, and this would express basically the reliability and the accuracy of caller location. Plus, it is said that national authorities may, it's an option, it's not an obligation, also adopt vertical criteria that are to be expressed in meters if it is adopted. So that's for the mobile networks. For fixed networks, it's basically related to the physical address of the owner of the line, quite logically. So I will not, I think it's quite straightforward. I don't have to go too much in the details on that, but yeah, this is what I could show you. What's important to have in mind is that the member states and the competent authorities in the member states have 1 year to adopt this criteria. So 1 year is actually quite short. It's 1 year after the entry into force of the legislation. And after that year, the authorities will have to report this criteria to the European Commission. So this is how the legislator intended to make sure that like this will finally be enforced, because as I said, this is a requirement that existed since 2009. Some of you might wonder, what about the European cooperation on this matter? Because we've been many actors, not only emergency services, consumer organizations, but also OS providers, mobile network operators, etc. Many of us have called for European coordination on this matter, basing ourselves on the fact that we use the same technology from like in all European countries, and the value of life actually should be the same in every country. So why should every country do that on their own? And why isn't there some European cooperation? So in the final version of the act, which was adopted, some elements were added. So it is important to recall the principle of sincere cooperation between the member states, and that principle should give possibility to cooperate in some forum. It was added in a recital, which is, as I said, not very binding in a way. So there's something. However, no concrete action has been taken by any official organization on this matter. So neither BEREC nor the relevant fora has done anything on this. And actually, some organizations consider that they lack the competence to work on this matter. So there is nothing really concrete happening. And at the same time, the clock has started basically, and the time is running out, which is why EENA is actually looking into providing that recommendation in the criteria. Here, I will give the floor to my colleague, Gary Machado, who will tell us more about the EENA plans on that matter. Gary?
Thank you, Benoit. Thank you very much, and hello, everyone. So, yes, as introduced by Benoit, we've decided to try to help you in these regards. We at EENA have started to work and will be working a lot in the next month to define criteria for color location, only restricted to handset-derived color location or handset-based color location, meaning that we will not deal with network-based or fixed network location. This is really important to mention to you. We'll focus on what many of us call advanced mobile location and everything around it. And we will not focus on network-based technologies and fixed network technologies. So with that regard, you will have to report your own criteria if you're representing a member states to the Commission based on your own work. On our side, we will be working on providing a recommendation for criteria on handset-derived location. And we intend to be able to present you a draft at the EENA conference in Ljubljana and to finalize the work by September 2023. Ideally, and you will see later from Benoit's slides, this should give you 6 extra months to review our recommendation on handset-derived criteria, so that hopefully you can take this criteria as your own criteria if you wish to, or do some further work based on these criteria to make it your own criteria. We do that, as Benoit said, basically because we believe the value of life is the same across Europe, the technologies are the same, and we do not see any reasons why we should have diverging criteria across Europe. I hope we hope that this work will be useful for you, and of course we will be consulting our members quite a lot in the next month on these specific criteria. And again, I just wish to remind very clearly, just to be very clear, you'll see by the end of the day another communication by EENA on that very matter, on that work we are starting to undertake. We just want to make sure that you know that EENA will not be providing a recommendation on all aspects of co-location, just to be very, very clear. I give you the floor back, Benoit, I believe.
Thank you, Gary. That's very clear and very helpful. Just want to insist again on what you say. If EENA will not look at other types of locations or just handset-based location, doesn't mean that the national authorities don't have to do it. They will also have to look at it, but EENA will only focus its work on the handset-based location. As we finish the parts on co-location, I will give the floor to questions, and there were 3 questions that were asked, all of them very accurate. So the first one was from Irache Gomez-Usaita. So how would the Apple emergency SOS via satellite feature fit in this legislation? The answer is that it doesn't fit in this legislation. This legislation covers the telecommunications networks in general and communications via telecoms. So emergency SOS just come on the sides. As for public warning via satellites, actually it's complementary to this legislation, but it's not part of it. Next question is by Knut Solstad. Is the X% and X meter defined by the member states? Yes, it is defined by the member states, by the relevant authorities in the member states, and it's not a European thing. There will be nothing or no threshold coming from the European level. And one question from Stuart Walsh that is actually directed to you, Gary. So if you can unmute yourself. So why only focus on handset-derived location?
Well, EENA it's is very much limited by its resources. We wish to recall here that when responding to BEREC, apparently many national telecom regulators said they felt they didn't have the competence to deal with much of it. So you can imagine with the size of the little team at EENA, we do not have the resources to look at all aspects of co-location and to come up with quickly available recommendations for each and every aspect. That's why we prefer to do what we can, which is already quite a lot for us, to be honest, and do our part on one aspect of these location criteria, but we cannot do it all, and we cannot do more than this.
Thank you, Gary. And finally, there was a 4th question from Susan Faulkner. Does the regulation require indoor location, specifically floor and room? So the regulation does not require indoor location as such. However, possibility is given to the member states to adopt criteria regarding the vertical location. So it's up to the member states to define whether they would require vertical location, especially in terms of floor level. Then when it comes to the specific indoor location, no, it is not required. So here what is said by the Court of Justice is basically a location that is as good as possible. So if the member states consider that like you should go deeper and require some indoor location, it is possible. Same for the vertical location, but there's no strong mandate at EU level, neither on indoor location nor on vertical accuracy. I hope I answered your questions. You can always email me after the webinar, so otherwise. Then we'll move to another topic, which is accessibility. And here I understand some of you might be lost because here again, there's plenty of different legislation on accessibility, and it's hard to find which is the most appropriate and how they are interconnected together. So I just thought I would first recall them and recall what is in what. So first in the EECC, as I said, it's basically the principle and the philosophy that access to emergency services should be equivalent for people with disabilities compared with other end users. If people can like call the emergency services, there should be an equivalent mean of access for people with hearing disabilities, for instance. What was not defined is what is meant by equivalent. In the European Accessibility Act, this is quite more precise actually, as it requires the implementation of real-time text, which is one of the technologies that can be used, and it is required by 2027. On top of that, total conversation is also required when you have, if other end users have video communication to PSAPs, then total conversation should also be implemented. Finally, there were also some elements in the roaming regulation regarding the fact that accessibility means should work for people who travel to other member states. So for foreign roamers, accessibility should also be a principle, and such means should be promoted actually when entering another member state. And we receive the SMS, the welcome SMS, will be informed about the accessibility means in the next months actually. So this is for the recall of the current EU legislation. What this delegated act addresses is actually that definition of equivalence, because as I said, it's something we didn't have, and what is equivalent is a fax equivalent to a 112 call, not really based on what this was what to be defined. And actually what this delegated act does is that it clearly defines what it means with a set of functional equivalence requirements. So when you want to ensure equivalent access to 112, you have to meet these, six functional requirements. The first one is that emergency communications should be two-way interactive. So there should be a conversation between the PSAP and the person initiating the emergency communication. It should be available in a seamless way, which is without pre-registration to end users traveling in another member state. The third is that it should be provided free of charge to the end user. The fourth requirement is that it should be routed without delay to the most appropriate PSAP. The fifth one is that there should be equivalent levels of caller location information, which means that the criteria that are adopted by the member state authorities that apply to 112 calls, for instance, they should also apply to the accessibility means. So this is quite important to have in mind. And finally, there should be some measures to raise awareness of this accessibility means. So these are the six requirements that must be met to ensure equivalent access to 112. And to ensure this is enforced, actually it is required from the member states to report to the European Commission an assessment on how the means that they have in their country meets the functional requirements that have been defined. And here again, the member states will have 1 year to produce that report to the European Commission. Which brings me to the end of the part on accessibility. Is there any question on that matter? No, then I'll just move to the next one. I'm almost done, don't worry. I hope I'm not too boring. And actually I see a question from Andreas Matisse. Is registration further defined? Short answer is no, it's not further defined. You have more context in the recitals, especially, I won't have time to look at which recital, but in essence, like you don't have any definition for registration yet. I invite you to have a look at the appropriate recital. It's recital number 11, if you have a look at the legislation. All right, so, is there any? Yes, there is another question by Jaz. So does pre-registration include downloading a new local emergency app? So here again, registration is not defined, so I can't exactly tell you what it means. But I can tell you that like having to download a new app where you would anyway have to register would not meet the functional equivalence requirements. And then a question by Björn Skoglund. Do you mean that only RTT is covered in the legislation, but not total conversation? So what the European Accessibility Act says is that when there is a voice call that is possible to emergency services, which is the case for anyone can call 112, then real-time text should be implemented as an equivalent mean of accessibility. When the people have the possibility to make video calls to emergency services, which is not the case everywhere, but it might be the case in the future, then total conversation will have to be implemented as I said, as an equivalent measure. But if you have only voice calls, then only RTT is required in the legislation. And I think I don't have more question. Yeah, I see one more question by Jaz. What exactly means when video is available in terms of when this is required to be supported? So yeah, I think I just answered this question with my previous response. So when I say when video is available, it's when anyone has the possibility to make a 112 communication by video, actually, which may be the case in the future. Then total compensation will have to be implemented. And Anne-Marie Velker, RTT also for eCall. I'm not aware of that. It is like eCall works as a technically quite different as a normal emergency communication. So I don't think RTT is mandated for that. But as you probably saw, there will be a new proposal coming. So it may change, but at the moment it is not required. And I think we're good for the questions. Otherwise, it's not too late. So I'll just be answering to that later, because now we're going to speak about the routing to the most appropriate PSAP, which is addressed in paragraph 2 of Article 109 of the EECC. And something that is quite interesting here is that a new concept is added to the legislation, is contextual information. So here you have the definition. I told you how important it is to have a look at the definitions. Here is why. So contextual information means the information conveyed through an emergency communication by the end user or derived automatically from the device of the end user or the relevant network in order to enable the timely identification of the intervention resources of the emergency services and the fast arrival of the emergency services. So at the moment, like caller location is part of that. In the future, we can imagine that more data will be part of it. So here I see in one of the recited that contextual information contributes to the description of the emergency incident, for instance, the physical environment, the condition and abilities of the persons involved, the location of the incident, etc. So we can imagine that in the future, with the availability of many data on top of an emergency communication, this term of contextual information would be very important. And what the decision makers have been doing here is basically just to really add that for future consideration. Because if we look at what really comes out of it in the delegated regulation, there is not much for the moment. It's here. It's basically that stage 1 PSAP should be able to transmit caller location and other contextual information to emergency services, which actually is not always the case at the moment, including for caller location. So should be able to should be possible to do that. That's quite an important requirement. But here the part on contextual information will of course be more relevant as the technology progresses, actually. And still on routing to the most appropriate PSAP, there is a mention regarding the interoperability of apps. You know that sometimes the apps don't work outside of the country where it's supposed to serve a purpose. So here the member states are required by the European Commission to cooperate to identify some common requirements for the mobile apps to ensure the interoperability of these apps, to make sure that they will work in the different countries and they will connect with the right PSAP and provide data to the relevant PSAP. But that is for future requirements, actually. So just here, the only obligation is on the member states to cooperate with the European Commission. So there's not much really that's come from this legislation on this. I think that's it for my part on the routing to the most appropriate PSAPs. I'm just going to have a look if there is a question. Yes, there is a question from Irache Gomez Usaita. So, are zero-cost emergency text or video calls already a reality anywhere? That's a good question. I'm not aware of that. I don't have the answer. So, if I see something, I will forward you the information, Irache. Yeah, sorry, I can't answer this question. And something, yeah, I don't see any other question. So I can move to the final part. So we are almost at the end of the webinar. Do not worry if you have anything. Yeah, towards NG 112. So if you don't know what NG 112 is, I invite you to have a look at the website of EENA, because you'll find plenty of useful content explaining next generation 112. This is what NG 112 stands for. and you'll see, but it's basically the adaptation of emergency communications to newer generations of networks, so 4G, 5G mostly, and basically to make sure to benefit from the digital transformation and all the applications that come from that. And here, what is required from the member states is to adopt a roadmap on the migration to NG112. If you have a look at the legislation, NG112 will not appear anywhere because sometimes the EU institutions adopt very specific words. And here, what is referred is emergency communications through packet switch technologies for electronic communications networks. I hope I did not forget any word in that. So in short, it's NG112, but it's just emergency communications through packet switch technologies in the legislation. So here, what is required is that it's from the member states to just have a roadmap detailing the agenda on the migration to NG112. And then the legislation is actually a bit more specific on what this roadmap should contain. So in that roadmap that is to be adopted by the member state, you should have the expected time and date of deployment of emergency communications through packet switch technologies. Sorry, it's quite long to say. You should precise in that roadmap whether this is enabled in the core network or via mobile application, have a timeline, the legal mandate, some intermediary milestones, like if you're going to have to do some public procurement, some consultations, etc. And finally, to identify any interoperability or continuity issue that could be addressed by the European Commission through specific measures. So this is what is required in that roadmap. And the member states this time will have 9 months to prepare it. So this is quite a short time actually to work on to have quite an extensive reflection actually. So it's important to start as fast as possible. I see 2 questions. Actually, the first one is a comment. It's from Vitor Judicibus. So it was a response to Irach's question earlier, which is in Portugal, video calls and chat for deaf people are 0 rated. Thank you very much, Vitor, for that information. So Irache, if you need more information, I suggest you contact Vitor as well to understand how it is done in Portugal, because actually Portugal is quite a leading country in that sector. And then I have a question from Colum Donnelly. Any news about Reverse 112? So yes, there are news about Reverse 112. So Reverse 112 is about public warning systems. So public warning systems are not in the scope of this legislation, so it is not covered. But of course, there are news about it, and EENA sometimes communicates about it, and we'll have some sessions about the at the EENA conference on public warning systems. So stay tuned. Then one question from Björn Skoglund: is the deadline 9 months after it is published in the EU official journal, or 9 months after the Delegated Act went in force in December? So I'm going to have a point on the deadlines right at the end of that webinar. So this is a bit the moment of suspense. So I hope you'll stay with me for another 5 to 10 minutes, so that I will tell you everything about the deadlines, because it's actually quite technical. Just before that, before talking about the dates, I would like just to sum up, because there's many things that I said, and perhaps you had many diversions during the webinar. So just to sum up very quickly what is in the legislation, what is required from the member states. So what there is improvement on color-location, precisions, useful precisions on what equivalent access means in the legislation, and third, we speak about the contextual information and that it should be conveyed from the PSAP to the appropriate emergency service. What is required from the member states? Many things, actually, as you can see. So the first one is to adopt accuracy and reliability color-location criteria, both for fixed networks and for mobile networks. And when we say mobile networks, it includes the handset-based and the network-based location. So that will give a lot of work for the member states authorities. At the same time, they'll also have to report to the European Commission with a roadmap on the transition to NG112, with the color location requirements, which I have just mentioned, with the assessment report on how the means of access that they offer to people with disabilities, how they meet the functional equivalence criteria, which I detailed in that webinar. And finally, they'll have to provide information on the performance of emergency communications and caller location information to the most appropriate PSAP. This is actually not something new, which is why I haven't mentioned it. It's basically the information that allows the European Commission to publish a report every 2 years on the status of the implementation of 112, but it is still part of the reports they will have to do to the European Commission. So it's many things. And on top of that, they also have to cooperate with the European Commission to identify common interoperability requirements for mobile applications. I'm just going to check if there is more questions. I don't see any. So I can move to the part on the dates, actually, which is what some of you are waiting for. So here is a bit the technicity. So in December 2022, the delegated regulation was adopted by the European Commission. That's the official words that is in the treaties and was in the delegation is the adoption of the delegated regulation. However, this is not over for the procedure, actually, because after the adoption, the European Parliament and the Council of the EU, so which represent, as I said, the citizens and the national governments, they have a period of generally 2 months to make objections to the text. So here in that text, it will actually be 2 months. So by 16th of February 2022, until then, they can make objections to the text, and that means they can basically reject the text. In such case, the Commission would have to do again all the work and to publish something else, which is something that's practically never happens. It can happen on very political files, but not so much when it's quite technical. So in general, you don't see any objections to the text. But we're still in that procedure, in that process when the national governments and the parliaments can make objections to the text. A few days after this period of 2 months has passed, the Act is published in the official journal of the EU. So it takes generally between 3 days and 2 weeks, depending on the work that the secretaries have to do there, because there's a lot of legislation which are being adopted. So it can take a few days. And 3 days after the publication in the official journal of the EU, the Act enters into force. And that date of entry into force will serve us as a reference for all the deadlines which I have mentioned. So here we estimate it's early March 2023. It can be end of February 2023, depending on the day of publication in the official journal. So if I try to recap the deadline that we had, and if we take as a reference the date of March 2023, as I said, it can be February 2023. We'll know a bit later the exact date. So it's starting from that we'll count the deadlines. So that brings us in December 2023 to produce the roadmap on the migration to NG 112. And in March 2024 to adopt and report the caller location criteria, and to report on the accessibility means and how they are functionally equivalent in the countries. So these are the deadlines that we have in the Act. Which brings me to the end of this webinar. Thank you for listening, and still time to ask a few questions. And I see some of them have been asked. Let me just find it. I just see, typo 2023 instead of 2022. Yes, I probably say something wrong. I'd probably say it's 2022 instead of 2023 somewhere. Yes, 16th of February 2023, sorry. I'm one of these people who take a long time to get adjusted to the new year. So I still, I made that mistake. So sorry for that, and thank you for correcting Irache and Salvatore. And I see a question from Giuseppe Lelo. Very interesting and useful webinar for my PhD project. Will you provide a certificate of attendance for this webinar? Thank you for that question. I don't know, to be honest. I think we can provide something. So please send us an email after this webinar, and we will be able to help you with that. Then Björn Skoglund raised a challenge, which is the lack of standard for total conversation, which would lead to risk of different solutions in different member states. This is indeed a big challenge, and in general, it's a challenge in European legislation, is that It just says a few things. Of course, not everything. It sometimes lacks clarity, which is quite of an issue. And the risk, as Bjorn highlighted, is that there's a risk of solutions that differ from one member state to another. And when we say that the solutions differ, first, it's a problem for the industry, but worse than that, it makes the solutions not really interoperable between them, which in the end is detrimental to public safety in Europe. So that's indeed the challenge that you have highlighted. And Bjorn corrected, standard is to be implemented in January 2027, quite late. I agree with you. It's something that is being faced in also on the other side of the pond. Then I have a question from Javier. RTT and video over LTE will not be provided by operators in the short term in Europe. Will app be the solution? I do not have the answer, to be honest. Here the mandate is for 2027. Until then, as I said, there should be equivalent access to emergency services. App can be the solution as long as the following criteria are made. Here are the criteria to be met. If the app meets them, then the solution will be considered as functionally equivalent until 2027. If not, then there is no functional equivalence. All right, I do not see any other questions. So thank you for your participation in this webinar. So this webinar has been recorded, and we'll be sharing the recording and the slides probably in your mailbox as well on our website. So you can actually listen to all our webinars on eena.org/webinars. If something is not clear, please feel free to write me on my email or on LinkedIn or any other channel. Thank you for your attention. Take care, and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Merci, Benoît.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you to my colleague, Amy, who was with me for this past hour and a half already for the logistics.
Excellent. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks, Amy.